President Trump has Georgia on his mind. I'm Elaine Quijano, and this is Red and Blue. Ahead on the program, the president revisits the core Trump campaign principles of America First. But will his ongoing refusal to release tax returns undermine his push to fulfill one of his key promises? And he predicted a Trump victory last November, but now this college professor has a different prognostication: impeachment. Alan Lichtman explains the how, when, and the why. But first, politics in the Peach State. Polls are closed in Georgia, where Democrats see an opening to flip the congressional seat left open by Tom Price, President Trump's Secretary of Health and Human Services. Democrat Jon Ossoff, a 30-year-old former congressional staffer, is one of the frontrunners in the traditionally Republican district, in part because GOP support is split among 11 candidates. Here's how the Washington Post describes the race. This suburban swath north of Atlanta resembles the cracked mirror of the GOP's national identity crisis, with 11 candidates bitterly feuding over what it means to be a Republican in the age of President Trump. President Trump hasn't backed any one Republican, but has used his Twitter account to target Ossoff, the leading Democrat. This morning calling him very weak and very bad, and urging Republicans to force a runoff election, which he says would be an easy win. We'll have more on the Georgia race in a moment, but while President Trump was acting as a surrogate for all 11 Republicans in that race, he made a return trip to Wisconsin on Tuesday. He was the first Republican to carry the state since Ronald Reagan, and this visit came with just over a week until the president marks 100 days in office. His message to the blue-collar community of Kenosha: I'm keeping my promises. He visited a tool manufacturing company and signed an executive order designed to make it harder for companies to replace American workers with cheaper foreign labor. He also told supporters that the order was a key part of his America First platform.
The policy of our government is to aggressively promote and use American-made goods and to ensure that American labor is hired to do the job. It's America first. You better believe it. It's time. It's time, right? It's time.
The executive order instructs government agencies to review and strengthen existing policies that encourage firms to hire American labor. When a senior administration official was asked about following it up with legislation, the official said the executive order was the most muscular action the White House could take. The trip to Wisconsin was one of just a handful the president has taken since inauguration. Our Mark Knoller counts 5 out-of-town trips for speeches from President Trump, compared to 9 from President Obama and 18 from President Bush at this point in their first terms. Mr. Trump also hasn't taken any trips abroad. Vice President Mike Pence, however, is on a 10-day trip to the Asia-Pacific region, where earlier this week he visited the doorstep of North Korea and warned the regime of U.S. action if it didn't terminate its nuclear program. The Trump administration has ramped up its rhetoric toward North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in recent days. And on Tuesday, the president said Americans should be concerned about the prospect of a nuclear war.
You don't know exactly who you're dealing with. I had a great meeting with the president of China, and that meeting tells me a lot, and you've seen a lot of things happen. They have a pretty good power, not a great power perhaps, but a pretty good power over North Korea. We're going to see what happens. It's a very tricky situation. This should have been done by President Obama. It should have been done by previous presidents all the way back to Clinton. And everybody pushed it off. They just pushed it off. And, you know, if you look at Clinton, you read his book, he talked about how he made this wonderful deal. He didn't make a good deal. He made a terrible deal. All he did is say, essentially, do whatever you want to do. And now I'm put in a position where he actually has nuclear, and we're going to have to do something about it.
Let's bring in Cameron Joseph and Sean Sullivan in D.C. Cameron is Washington bureau chief for the New York Daily News, and Sean is a congressional reporter for the Washington Post. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Sean, let me start with you. We heard President Trump putting blame for the North Korean challenge on his predecessors. In terms of substance, Sean, how different, in fact, is this White House's approach from past administrations?
Well, I think that's going to be what we find out in the coming weeks. I think this president is still trying to get to know the situation and how he wants to approach this. And what we heard from him in leveling blame against past presidents is very much in line with what we've seen from President Trump and then candidate Trump on the campaign trail, in difficult situations, blaming other leaders for problems that he is confronting. And so, it remains to be seen. I mean, how aggressive is this administration going to be towards North Korea? How open are they going to be to working with China to try to resolve tensions, which is what a lot of lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill are asking for? That's what we're going to see in the coming months. Right now, it's really too early to tell what this administration's approach, policy-wise, is going to be to North Korea.
Cameron, what do you think? Is it too soon to tell?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think a lot of this is going to depend on what China decides to do. Obviously, they have North Korea basically as a client state for the last 60 years. At the same time, they don't want direct confrontation. They definitely don't want war in the region, and so I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays. And it's really unclear, while President Trump is criticizing his predecessors, what exactly he's going to do differently. They said they were sending a carrier towards the Korean peninsula. It turns out that it actually wasn't anywhere near there, we found out today. And so it really remains to be seen what policy changes and, frankly, what policy President Trump has past some saber rattling right now. And so we're just going to have to wait and hopefully that things don't go sideways there.
Yeah, a lot of open questions right now. Well, critics have charged that the White House attention on these recent challenges overseas has undermined the president's America First promise. Sean, do you think that his base cares about that?
I think that, in the coming months, if we start to see more of a focus on, situation abroad and foreign policy and not as much focus on domestic things, then yeah, I think that could become an issue. You heard him earlier in that soundbite saying America first, America first. That is what we heard from Trump as a candidate time and again. And when you look at the legislation on Capitol Hill, in the last few weeks, we've not really seen anything that spearheads any sort of infrastructure program or jobs program domestically. Of course, we had a big debate over healthcare that went nowhere. So I think, yeah, there are going to be a lot of voters in Trump's base who are saying, look, we voted for this candidate for president because he thought, because we thought he would prioritize our needs. And right now he's dealing with a foreign policy situation that is very turbulent abroad. So I think that's why we saw him go to Wisconsin today, make the speech that he did, issue the executive order that he did to sort of signal to his supporters and his base, hey, I haven't forgotten about my campaign promises to you guys. Now, whether an executive order is enough to satisfy a lot of his supporters, that remains to be seen. I think a lot of them would want to see stronger legislation, perhaps. But I think it's clear that the White House understands that they can't just look past some of the promises that the president made as a candidate about, essentially his America First platform.
Yeah, Cameron, what do you think the president was hoping to accomplish on his visit to Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday, which, as you noted in your piece, is a working class community?
Yeah, I think it was a state and a region of the state that he won very narrowly, and it's an area that he's going to need to do very well again in 3+ years if he's going to become president for a second term. And the real question is whether he can get anything done substantively in the long term. This executive order really has no teeth. It really isn't going to do much in the long term. It's a good one-day story for him, but the question is whether he can really get anything done legislatively. And so far, he hasn't come up with anything so far in terms of real law changes. The only thing that's come out of Congress that has helped him really in the long run is the Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, which was a reason that a lot of people voted for him, especially some conservatives who didn't love him. But he's going to have to get something, put points on the board. And he keeps talking about these 100 days. The first 100 days was something that internally was something really important to them. We're closing in on that. We don't really see new laws. So it's tough.
Yeah, and to follow up on your point, Cameron, I mean, I thought it was interesting. The comment from the White House was that an executive order was the quote-unquote most muscular thing the administration could do. What did you think about that, Cameron? It's like tacit acknowledgement, essentially.
It is. Yeah, they can't do that much without Congress. Congress is the one that makes the laws. Now, some of this is President Trump having a very different idea of what being a Republican means than some of the Republicans in Congress. At the same time, he hasn't been able to get anything done, and President Obama got a lot done in the first 100 days. Granted, there was a major economic crisis that spurred the stimulus forward, but it's really a struggle for him right now, and part of that is President Trump and the fact that he hasn't really gotten a lot of his people in place yet and on board yet, and they're warring internally about exactly what they should be pursuing. Part of it is that he keeps changing his mind about what he wants to do. He said he's going to move on from healthcare reform and move on to taxes. Now he's saying the reverse. Obviously, foreign policy tends to intrude on any president. We saw that with President George W. Bush, who basically ran as a domestic candidate, promising not to get involved in foreign entanglements, and then you saw what happened with 9/11, and that changed his whole presidency and really defined it. So some of this is just, it's very hard to be president, it's very hard to get things done. Some of these are self-inflicted wounds.
Sean, let me ask you, there's a movement from Democrats not to support any tax reform measure unless President Trump releases his tax returns. What do you make of that as a strategy?
Well, I think it shows the Democrats think that, you know, the fact that the president has not released his taxes is something that they think angers a lot of Americans, and something that they think that they can use in any debate about taxes or tax reform to, you know, kind of, blunt any momentum Republicans have from the very beginning. I mean, you know, when you look at the larger context of this, it is pretty unprecedented what this president has done and what he did as a candidate in terms of not releasing his taxes. And so they're going to use every opportunity in a debate about taxes to bring that up. And so it's not going away. You know, we're seeing this. We're seeing Democratic lawmakers on the Hill say that this should be part of, you know, any, perhaps even, you know, any debate or investigation into, you know, Trump's and his aides' potential ties to Russia. You know, we're hearing it obviously in the context of the tax reform debate. So this is going to continue to be an issue until the president decides to release his tax returns, and so far he hasn't done that.
Well, Cameron, you asked Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer about this on Tuesday. What did he say?
He basically said it's going to be much harder to get any tax reform done. And I think he has a valid point. Tax reform is not easy to get done. It's about as easy as healthcare, and we saw how well that went. There's a reason we haven't seen comprehensive tax reform since the 1980s. It's not simple. There's a lot of different counter pressures, and it's hard to get everybody on board, even when everyone's acting in good faith. And right now, it's a very toxic partisan environment in D.C. On top of that, Republicans can't agree on exactly what they'd want, even in a perfect world, and President Trump has some different ideas than some of the congressional Republicans. But this tax issue, his own taxes, is huge because he could be making a ton of money off of some of these changes, especially with real estate business. The bottom line is very directly affected by tax rates and how things you can carry forward debts, which we saw in one of the few years we have seen it with Trump in the 95 returns. It looks like he wrote off a huge amount of debt that he probably meant he didn't have to pay taxes for a couple of years after that. So the real question is, it's a very complicated issue. It's sometimes people glaze over when they're hearing about this. Tax reform is not something that all but the nerdiest really get into. But American people can understand the president's going to make money off of any changes, and that really could be one of the daggers for this very complicated effort that I don't think is going to be moving very easily.
Yeah, and tax is certainly a top of mind at this time of year. Sean Sullivan and Cameron Joseph in Washington, appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Turning back to the special congressional election in Georgia, as we mentioned, Jon Ossoff is one of the frontrunners in this Republican-dominated race. And according to our numbers, the Democrat has taken an early lead, but there are still many votes left to be counted. But in order for Ossoff to win the seat outright, he would need to get more than 50% of the vote. If no candidate reaches that threshold, the top two contenders, regardless of party, will be placed in a runoff election. Now, for a closer look, I want to turn to CBS News Elections Director Anthony Salvanto and congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes, who is in our Washington bureau. I'm so excited to have you both. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
All right, Anthony, let me start with you. What do we know about the results and the methodology to get those results?
Well, you're right, it's early. And polls closed 2 hours ago, but it takes a while to count all these ballots. And so what we're looking at is early vote in right now. I'm seeing Ossoff, the Democrat, at 58% of what's in, and that was with 9% of precincts reporting. So again, to emphasize, it is very early. But there's a bit of a story in that, which is that's mostly early vote. They usually count the folks who voted early and voted absentee first, and that's what is in that count. He needed to do well in that early vote because Republicans typically do better on the election day turnout. The question is whether that number that he's got now can then sustain if the Republicans did have good election day turnout. Right now, I would expect he's tracking on about what he needs, but we'll see if it holds up.
Okay, Nancy, I know you were in Georgia's 6th District over the past couple of days and spent time with Ossoff. What's he like, and what kind of campaign is he running?
Well, he's the luckiest political novice in America.
Yeah.
I mean, usually, if you're a political newcomer, you're struggling to get your name out there. You're struggling to raise money. These are not problems that Jon Ossoff has had over the past couple of months. He's young. He's 30 years old. He's a documentary filmmaker. He's a former congressional aide, spent about 5 years on Capitol Hill. So he knows his way around politics, but he's running, in some ways, a very complicated campaign because, on one hand, it's obviously that anti-Trump energy that, if he is going to win, is going to help push him over the top. At the same time, all of that energy, all the help from outside, all of the money, all of the volunteers has left him vulnerable to this notion that he's beholden to national Democrats and not to Georgia Democrats and his own district. And so he's been arguing that this is a local race and it's going to be won and lost on local issues, even though his campaign slogan is "Make Trump Furious."
And Nancy, I remember in one of your pieces you highlighted a robocall for Jon Ossoff from a celebrity. Tell us about that and the potential that something like that in a district like that could even backfire.
Right. It's a double-edged sword. But this, in a special election, Anthony can tell you, all the rules sort of go out the window. You basically had to go from 0 to 100 in the space of 2 months ever since Donald Trump named Tom Price to be his Secretary of Health and Human Services. So Ossoff threw his hat into the ring, so did 17 other candidates. They're all scrambling to raise money, and suddenly, thanks to liberal websites, especially Daily Kos, but others as well, Ossoff finds that he's swimming in $8.3 million of campaign cash. By way of comparison, Elaine, the top Republican has raised about $500,000 in that same amount of time. Tom Price himself never raised anywhere near that kind of money for his races, and he was raising money for 2 years, not 2 months. So it's an unusual situation, and he and his campaign have gone to great lengths to point out that even if you just look at money that's come to him from Georgia residents, he's still at the top of the pack. And I even got a phone call from his campaign manager who was very concerned about all of these national stories, pointing out volunteers. And we met them coming from out of state, coming from Tennessee or New York. And he was making the point that, yes, in this final week, there are outsiders coming in to help us. But until last week, it was 95% Georgians who are just as fired up. If you're a Democrat, you're looking for the same kind of redemption in Georgia as you are in any other state.
That's an interesting behind-the-scenes tidbit there, getting phone calls based on the coverage that people are seeing, knowing just how close it could be. So, Anthony, it's been interesting. We've seen President Trump taking notice of this race, posting several tweets about it. What do you think that indicates?
Well, one of the things that's interesting, even as we watch the votes come in, is kind of the time in which this election played out. So if, in fact, the Democrat has done very well in the early vote, that tells you that the Democrats were energized and got that early jump on things. And right now he is, and I can tell up to the second, he's still at that 57% or so, with most of the votes still, needs to be counted. But that same day, that election day turnout, if the president is tweeting and trying to get Republicans to go to the polls, that will show up later in the count and therefore a little bit later tonight. So we'll know in about an hour or so, I think, whether he really had that motivating effect on Republicans, if in fact they catch up, and then it turns out they stop Ossoff from getting that 50%.
And it's an open question, Elaine, just how much influence Donald Trump has in this particular district. He kind of underperformed in Georgia's 6th district. He only won by 1 point. By comparison, Mitt Romney 4 years ago won the district by 23 points. So this is, yes, it's a longtime Republican district, but it's suburban Atlanta. It's a diverse district, very well educated. And Democrats believe that if they really have been successful in firing up their voters, that they can pull this off. The tricky thing is that if they are going to pull it off, they have a much better shot today than they will 2 months from now. And that's because you've basically had 11 different Republicans all splitting the vote. You've had national Democrats like the president, like Marco Rubio, getting involved, but they're either saying vote for a Republican or vote for this particular Republican. There isn't a lot of unity around one particular person. If it goes to a runoff, that's going to change, and you'll have Ossoff going up against one pretty well-funded, very well-supported Republican candidate in June, and that'll be a different story.
Nancy, I can only imagine the attention that voters in the 6th District have been getting from the various campaigns. Tell me about what it is that voters told you. What do they make of this situation that they find themselves in, very much in the national spotlight?
Well, Georgia is one of those states that the Clinton campaign believed that it had an outside shot at winning in November. Obviously, that didn't happen. But if you are a Democrat in a state like Georgia and you didn't vote in November, you're probably feeling a bit of regret about that. You're probably feeling like, you'll do whatever it is that you need to do to even show your dissatisfaction with Donald Trump in some small way. Obviously, this isn't a referendum on Trump's presidency in the way that Democrats would like it to be. Clearly, Donald Trump himself is worried that that's the narrative. That's why he's tweeting up a storm about this race. But there are Democrats that I've spoken to, both volunteers for Ossoff who are from Georgia and outside, who say, I woke up on November 9th and I was devastated. And I thought, what can I do? I have nothing, there's nothing that I can do. I want to make a difference, but I don't know how. And so, some of them went to town halls and they protested and they got involved in Indivisible. And this is kind of the next step. This is one of the few concrete ways that Democratic voters, either in Georgia or those who are coming into the state for this race, can really show that that they realize that this is a high-stakes game that Democrats lost in November.
And Anthony, as Nancy just pointed out, for various reasons, it is more complicated than to just simply say this is a referendum. What happens in the 6th District in Georgia is a referendum on the Trump presidency. Nevertheless, how significant would it be if Jon Ossoff is able to pull off a victory?
Both parties are going to want to use this to tell a story, because no single special election ever predicts what happens in 435 races a year and a half from now. What they will do is, if the Democrats win, they're going to say, A, we energized our base. Okay, and I can tell you from the early vote that predominantly the people who cast early ballots were people who already voted in the presidential election in 2016. So the Democrats still have work to do tonight, I think, in making sure that new voters, if they want them, get to the polls, but they'll tell that story. Whereas the Republicans would love to win this, or at least hold on to this, and then say, our base is still with us. So everything that the president still has the ability to motivate Republicans, even in this district, and still hang on to it. Both of those are stories that they'd like to tell going forward, and use this as one data point, use this as one example. So that's kind of the thing to watch for what they'll say going through the next year.
And I think it would be sort of a tangible example, Elaine, that Democrats are really not just motivated to get out there and show up at a town hall protest and then go back to their daily lives, but really are focused on the long haul. Look, let's face it, Jon Ossoff may be a nice guy, but most Georgia Democrats had never heard of him 2 months ago. So he's part of the reason that they're motivated to go to the polls. The ones I've talked to like him, think he has the right ideas. But the bigger reason that he's going to get over 50%, if he does, is because of this mix of Democratic frustration, Democratic fear, the fact that they now know that they don't control Congress, they don't control the White House, they are completely out in the cold. Obviously, they've got a long way to go to flip not just the 6th, but the entire House of Representatives. They'd need to pick up 24 seats, not just one seat. But they see this as, a small, tangible step that they can take to kind of right the wrongs that were committed by a combination of the Clinton campaign and Democratic voters over the past year.
Yeah, a lot of Democrats really looking for an outlet for their frustrations right now. CBS News Elections Director Anthony Salvanto and congressional correspondent Nancy Cordes, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Coming up, they gotta behave. All options are on the table, and don't give us a reason. How will North Korea respond to the latest tough talk from the Trump administration? A foreign policy expert weighs in next. Plus, a surprise announcement from British Prime Minister Theresa May, what it could mean for the political future of the European continent when CBSN returns after this. Vice President Mike Pence says North Korea is getting the message from the U.S. to walk away from its nuclear activity. He's on a 10-day trip to the region and earlier this week visited the demilitarized zone that separates North and South Korea. After meeting with top officials in Japan on Tuesday, the vice president reiterated that the U.S. was keeping all options on the table when it came to North Korea.
The United States of America believes the time has come for the international community to use both diplomatic and economic pressure to bring North Korea to a place that it has avoided successfully now for more than a generation. And we will not rest and we will not relent until we achieve the objective of a denuclearized Korean peninsula.
Let's bring in Mark Jacobson in our Washington bureau. He's an adjunct professor at Georgetown in security studies and former advisor to the Secretary of Defense during the Obama administration. Mark, welcome.
Thanks for having me today.
What is the fundamental message from Vice President Pence on this trip to Asia?
Well, it's pretty clear from what the Vice President said that he wants to continue the policies that the Obama administration and, frankly, a dozen other presidencies before them have had, and that is to denuclearize North Korea, to keep peace on the Korean Peninsula, and to ensure that we don't see some sort of aggressive action from the North Koreans that would threaten the security of the region.
So the vice president said the U.S. would be open to diplomatic negotiations with North Korea. What could that actually look like?
Well, I wish it were so easy. The challenge is what you need is a multilateral approach, which means you need the Chinese in, you need to have the Japanese, and of course the South Koreans. But the North Koreans are pretty adamant. If you listen to their representative in New York earlier this week, he was very clear that the nuclear issue, nuclear weapons, are not on the negotiating table, and therefore I'm not optimistic that we're going to see any sort of multilateral talks or diplomatic engagement in the near future.
Well, the Trump administration might consider targeting Chinese banks that do business with North Korea as a way of further isolating the country. I wonder what you think of that strategy, Mark.
This is the issue of secondary sanctions. In other words, not just sanctions on the North Koreans, but sanctions on those doing business with the North Koreans. And I actually think this is an excellent idea. This is a bit of a play on what the last administration did with regards to Iran, secondary sanctions on those banks and in other nations that were willing to do business with the Iranians. So it's possible that this is why Trump has eased up a bit on the Chinese. He realizes that he needs Chinese support. And if he can have a little bit of a carrot in terms of easing up on the issue, for example, of China being a currency manipulator, he may get a little bit more Chinese support when it comes to this issue of secondary sanctions.
Well, Mark, President Trump said in an interview that previous administrations were, quote, outplayed by North Korea. You touched on this, but on a substantive level, how different of a policy is the Trump administration's policy compared to previous administrations?
On the one hand, I understand what he's saying, that no one has succeeded, and that's true. At the same time, I don't think that President Trump quite understands that this is an issue of winning a game or completing the mission. North Korea is going to be a continuing problem well after a Trump presidency. What I think you're seeing in terms of consistency, again, is this issue of going after the North Koreans using economic sanctions, and again, this call for denuclearization of the peninsula. What's a bit different is really the bellicose language coming out of the White House, and some of this counterproductive, arguing that if the North Koreans have another nuclear test, that could result in a preemptive U.S. strike on the North Koreans. I'm not sure that's the right way to go, and frankly, the only other way this ends is in a war on the Korean Peninsula, which will result in the loss of tens of millions of lives in South and North Korea alone.
Critically high stakes. Mark Jacobson in Washington for us. Mark, thanks very much for your insight. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Across the Atlantic, in the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Theresa May has called for a snap election in just 7 weeks. The announcement is an about-face from where May stood on the matter recently. She made an unexpected statement in London Tuesday.
I have only recently and reluctantly come to this conclusion. Since I became Prime Minister, I have said that there should be no election until 2020. But now I have concluded that the only way to guarantee certainty and stability for the years ahead is to hold this election and seek your support for the decisions I must take.
The Conservative leader hopes to win a strong parliamentary mandate as she begins negotiating Britain's exit from the European Union. Her party already has a double-digit lead in many British polls. President Trump and the Prime Minister spoke on the phone Tuesday evening. The White House says that during the call, the president wished May the best of luck in the process. Former President George H.W. Bush is back in a Houston hospital. She had been hospitalized for more than 2 weeks for pneumonia back in January. A Bush 41 spokesman confirms that the former president was admitted for observation Friday due to a persistent cough, which later turned out to be a mild case of pneumonia. Despite his illness, the 92-year-old is said to be in, quote, very good spirits. Up next, we'll take a look at the headlines that will give you a head start for Wednesday, including the growing list of New England Patriots who are not attending their honorary Super Bowl ceremony at the White House. Plus, he's not the only expert who has invoked the term, but when Alan Lichtman talks about impeachment, people stand up and take notice. My conversation with the oft-prescient professor about President Trump is next. You're watching CBSN. Here's a look at some of the headlines you'll be talking about on Wednesday. USA Today reports the first protected dreamer in the U.S. has been deported. President Trump promised to keep nearly 750,000 dreamers in the United States. They're undocumented immigrants brought to the country as children. This is the first documented case of a protected young person being deported and sent to his home country, Mexico. And The Hill reports the Trump administration may be rolling back more Obama-era environmental rules. The White House is reportedly considering whether to repeal or revise 2 major Obama administration regulations restricting air pollution from large sources. One of these regulations is responsible for shutting down hundreds of coal-fired power plants. And Boston.com reports the New England Patriots are heading to the White House, but not all of them. It's not uncommon for athletes to sit out White House visits, but at least 6 Patriots players have said they won't attend Wednesday's event because of the current administration. But Tom Brady, who's friends with President Trump, is expected to be there. Almost all of the polls leading up to the presidential election showed Hillary Clinton beating Donald Trump. But for months before Clinton's defeat, one professor predicted Trump's win. And now, as we close in on the president's first 100 days, that same professor is making a different prediction. He has a new book, and it's called The Case for Impeachment. American University professor and author Alan Lichtman joins me now. Alan, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So I want to do a little bit of Impeachment 101. You start chapter 1 of your book. High Crimes and Misdemeanors is the title, which is taken from the section of the Constitution that talks about impeachment. Here's that section. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Remind us, Alan, how does the process of impeachment work?
Well, the framers decided to give the power of impeachment solely to a political branch, to the Congress, not to the courts. That means you don't have to have an indictable crime to impeach a president. You just have to have some kind of egregious abuse of power or unfitness for office. And the House of Representatives, by a majority vote, can impeach a president. And that is not reviewable by the courts. But impeachment is not removal. It's just an indictment. A president is then tried by the United States Senate in a trial presided over by the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, and it takes a 2/3 vote to remove a president. And that vote, too, is not reviewable by any other body. The decision is final.
All right, so let's talk more about your book. What do you think makes President Trump vulnerable to impeachment?
I specify 8 different grounds on which I believe Donald Trump is vulnerable to impeachment. And to summarize it, I believe every American should be worried about our constitutional order, our rights and our liberties and our national security under a Trump presidency. And this is deeply rooted in a historical study of Donald Trump's full career as well as his presidency. So I examine such things as his history of flouting the law, his proclivity to tell lies, his conflicts of interest at home and abroad, his treatment of women, his abuse of power as president, and, of course, the ubiquitous connections to Russia, which run much more deeply than just what might or might not have happened during the campaign.
Because just to go back for a moment, a president can be impeached for actions that were committed before a person became president.
There is no restrictions on what the House can do for impeachment. Absolutely, they can look at what happened during the campaign or even before the campaign and decide to impeach a president. There's some precedent for this, not in presidential, but in impeachments of judges.
By the way, we should mention that we reached out to the White House for comment or response to your book. We have not heard back from the White House.
I haven't either, although I did hear from Trump when I made my prediction that he was going to win.
You got a note from the president?
I got a note from the president.
And what did that note say?
It said, good call, Professor. Congrats.
And since you've made this case, this prediction, any word from the president?
He hasn't said this is a good call.
Nothing. Well, let me ask you.
But part of my book does say there's a chapter in it called The Way Out, in which I say, you've listened to me before. Here's the ways you can avoid impeachment.
Yeah, so talk to me a little bit more about that. What is it that the president could do to sort of change the forecast here, the prediction that you've made?
Well, I said, first of all, he's got to get rid of Steve Bannon, who's such a dangerous influence on the president. He's got to cut the Mussolini Act, this penchant for praising dictators and for kind of acting in dictatorial ways, like claiming absolute presidential power here at home. He's got to hire a fact checker and use a fact checker to stop the incessant outpouring of lies and half-truths. I've even gone out on a limb and say, along with the White House physician, have a White House shrink. So you got kind of in-house therapy that can curb some of your tendencies, like these late night and early morning tweets.
So let me ask you, you mentioned Steve Bannon. There are reports that Steve Bannon's role has been diminished somewhat in the White House as other advisors, including Gary Cohn, the president's economic advisor, the president's daughter, his son-in-law, have seemed to gain more influence in the West Wing. So that could potentially change your forecast.
That's right. And, maybe he got an advanced copy of my book, and that's driving his decision.
Well, let me ask you, the president would only be the 3rd president to be impeached if, in fact, your prediction comes true. What are the chances, as you look at the landscape right now, what are the chances for this president?
I think they're pretty good, and I think there are two areas that are most likely to lead to impeachment. The first is conflicts of interest. And I go through at great length to describe the way in which conflicts of interest developed in the Trump administration and point out he's made a huge mistake by not divesting himself from his businesses. Sure, his kids are running it, but he still profits from everything that happens abroad and here in the United States. And with his interests abroad, he is running afoul of what we call the emoluments clause of the Constitution, which simply says a president can't take anything of value from a foreign nation, their agents, or entities controlled by a foreign government. There's no quid pro quo required. There's no specific amount, and there's great potential for that. We saw him receive valuable trademarks from China just after he seemed to back off his two-China policy. The envoy from the Philippines to the United States is the head of Trump Tower, Manila, where Trump has enormous financial interests. And we don't know about the full extent of his foreign interests because guess what? He still hasn't released his taxes. And, of course, he's got lots of domestic interests as well.
Well, let me ask you, though, the Republicans control Congress right now. So why would Republicans decide to draw up impeachment articles against the president?
First of all, if it turns out there was collusion with Russia between the Trump team and the Russians, or maybe even, heaven forbid, Trump himself, we don't know. I don't think they could avoid having to have an impeachment investigation and a vote. But beyond that, Donald Trump doesn't have deep relations with the Republicans in Congress. And they may come to see him as a liability. Remember, every one of them has to stand for re-election in 2018, and they may see him as an impediment to achieving their agenda. Look at his big flop on health care. And you also have to realize Republicans love Mike Pence. He's not a loose cannon like Donald Trump, but a down-the-pipe conservative Republican. And few people realize if Mike Pence became president under the 25th Amendment, he gets to appoint a vice president. And you could have the Republican dream team of Mike Pence and Paul Ryan.
All right. Certainly interesting theory, interesting prediction. Professor Alan Lichtman, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Before we go to break, your moment of levity. Alex Jones, founder of the site InfoWars, has been one of President Trump's most vocal supporters. Now the conservative radio host is caught in a difficult custody battle. Jones's ex-wife says he is unfit to have custody of his children due to the views he puts forth on his show. However, his attorney says Jones is, quote, playing a character. The story has been picking up traction, and that's where Stephen Colbert picks things up.
He's trying to prove that he's stable enough to care for children. Unfortunately for him, he works in front of a camera.
I'm a pioneer. I'm an explorer. I'm a human, and I'm coming. I'm animated. I'm alive. My heart's big. It's got hot blood going through it fast. I like to fight, too. I like to eat. I like to have children.
I'm going to say that might be grounds for you to not have children. Clips like that make Alex Jones seem less like a fit parent and more like a coked-out football coach in a police standoff. We were going to state. We were going to state.
Sir, get off the scoreboard.
We were going to state. But, just my high school? Just my high school?
That was good. That boy good. That boy good. That boy good.
But in a dramatic twist now, his lawyer is arguing that Alex Jones is playing a character and is a performance artist. I'm not sure that helps. Do we really want children to be raised by performance artists? No dessert until you finish eating your flag. Then tell me what it meant. But for one, I feel for Alex Jones. I mean, everybody knows that for many years I played a satirical right-wing character, okay? This happened to me all the time when I played my right-wing character, talk radio host Tuck Buckford. I think we have a clip. Jim?
Welcome back to Brain Fight. Listen. Listen, people, the liberals want to tattoo Obama logos onto the skin of Christian babies, okay? And it makes me want to fight. Fight with my fists. My blood is on fire. My heart is a volcano. It's time to throw a virgin in there. I'm a skeleton wrapped in angry meat. I'm a warrior. I'm a king. One thing I'm not is a performance artist, because I hate artists, because Andy Warhol put chemicals in Campbell's soup that turns veterans into bisexual zombies. Now a word from our sponsor, self-lubricating catheters. Buy my vitamins.
We'll see you back here again on Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern. But first, after the break, I'll get you caught up on the rest of the day's news, including the latest on the man suspected of shooting and killing 3 people on the streets of downtown Fresno. Why the feds say they may have prevented something much worse. You're watching CBSN.